Why did God choose Abraham? Abraham is remembered as the father of many nations, one of the pioneers of the faith, and as the founding patriarch of the three major global religions. But why, of all people, did God choose him for the task? And how did he earn favor in the eyes of the Lord? In this video, I'm going to explain the history of the early Christian faith, as well as answer the question of why God chose an ordinary man, like Abraham, to be the one whose lineage formed some of the most influential groups in history. To understand why a man like Abraham was chosen, you first need to understand the world that Abraham lived in. Abraham was one of the first major biblical figures, even before people like Moses. His story takes place long before many of the major events in the Old Testament, but after the fall of man, the Great Flood, and the Tower of Babel. When God first made humans, he created one man and one woman named Adam and Eve, but they chose to disobey him, bringing the first sin into the world and separating themselves from God, which later became known as the fall of man. They were kicked out of the home God had created for them and out into the world. As humanity spread, so did sin and evil. The Bible describes the world as filled with wickedness and sin, and God chose to judge the inhabitants of the world by flooding the earth. The heavens were opened, and it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. However, he chose to preserve Noah and his family. After the Great Flood, humanity continued to multiply. But instead of spreading throughout the earth as God commanded, they built a massive tower, famously known as the Tower of Babel. Their goal was to build it as high as the heavens, in order to make a name for themselves. But God destroyed the tower and spread them across the earth, confusing their languages so that they couldn't understand one another. Now there's one thing all these events have in common. They show how people continuously rebel against God, pursuing their own glory and sinful desires. At this point, you're probably wondering how this has anything to do with Abraham. Well, after Babel, God called Abraham, who was named Abram at the time. He commanded him to enter a new land and leave behind his relatives and homeland. But God also makes several important promises to him. He first promised to make him into a great nation with numerous descendants. God later tells Abraham that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. Second, that the promised land would be given to his descendants as a lasting inheritance. This land came to be known as Canaan. And third, that all the nations of the earth would be blessed through him. God didn't give Abraham much more information than that. He was forced to live on faith, following the call of the Lord without knowing where it would lead him. Unlike the people at Babel, who sought greatness, Abraham was promised it for living faithfully in the eyes of the Lord. But that doesn't explain why God chose him and not somebody else. Throughout his story, he struggles to follow God's plan. He doubts, faces fear and hardship, and makes mistakes. This means that Abraham was not chosen for his flawlessness, but one aspect of his character does stand out. He repeatedly trusted God, even during times of uncertainty. He wasn't chosen because he earned God's favor. He was chosen as part of a greater plan to bless all people in the world. In reality, God chose an imperfect person who was only willing to trust him to begin a new chapter for humanity. In the Bible, God usually chooses flawed people like Abraham. Great biblical figures like Moses, David, Jonah, Paul, and Peter all made mistakes and committed devastating sins, not unlike us. But why does this matter in a biblical context? Abraham faithfully followed the Lord, and God kept his promises to him. He did become a great nation. His descendants remain numerous to this day, and most importantly, all people far and wide were blessed through him. Jesus is a direct descendant of Abraham, and his sacrifice is the blessing that gives all people a chance at eternal life. So why did God choose Abraham? Because God chooses to work through imperfect people for a greater cause, giving us people to imitate. We are not perfect, but through faith in God, we are made whole. It's the same reason David or Paul were chosen. Through Abraham came a covenant, which ultimately led to Jesus himself. Abraham is there to remind us that God's plans don't depend on perfect people. They depend on a perfect God.